Nurses of psych wards, what patient creeped you the hell out? So one of the patients would just sit and stare at the ceiling, never speaking. But one day, out of nowhere, he looked at me and said, "They're waiting for you too." When I asked who he was talking about, he just started laughing. Later that day, he tried to harm himself, saying he needed to meet them before they came. There was this woman who kept making dolls out of paper and string. At first, it was innocent, just a hobby to pass the time. But soon, we noticed she started making dolls that resembled the staff. She'd put them in weird poses, with limbs bent in strange directions. And whenever one of the dolls ended up damaged, that specific staff member would have some sort of minor accident, spraining an ankle, cutting a finger. After a while, no one wanted to go near her room. I had a patient who would only talk when it was raining. Every time it rained, he'd sit by the window and have a full-on conversation with no one in particular. We'd ask him who he was talking to, and he'd always respond with the ones who come with the rain. On sunny days, he wouldn't say a word, but every storm brought him back to life. But one of the more unsettling patients would frequently look over my shoulder as if someone else was standing behind me. So when I asked him about it, he just said he's always there. Don't worry, he likes you. There was a guy who always talked about the man in the mirror. He said this figure would visit him every night at exactly 2:30 a.m. One night, I went into his room to check on him at that exact time, and I swear I saw something move in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. The patient was just sitting there, wide awake, smiling at me. One patient constantly scratched numbers into the walls over and over, repeating sequences like they were some kind of code. When we asked him about it, he'd just say, "I have to finish before they get here." No one could figure out what the numbers meant, but the intensity in his eyes when he said it still makes me uneasy. I once had a patient who always greeted me with, "I know your secrets." He never elaborated, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. One woman refused to look out the windows. She'd cover them with anything she could find: sheets, pillows, even books. When we asked her why, she whispered, "They're watching me from out there. If I look, they'll know I see them." There was a man who would talk about a shadow that followed him everywhere. He said it wasn't his own, but something darker, something that wanted to take over. One day he stopped talking altogether, and no matter what we did, we couldn't get him to speak again. One time, I had a patient who never slept. He said if he closed his eyes for too long, they would come. He didn't explain who they were, but he stayed awake for days at a time. I found out later that he hadn't slept for weeks before being admitted. It gave me chills thinking about what he might have seen that made him so afraid to sleep. So there was a woman who kept trying to dig holes in the walls of her room. She said she was trying to escape to the other side because they were coming to get her. She never explained who they were, but every time someone mentioned them, she'd start shaking uncontrollably. One of the patients would spend hours drawing what looked like mazes on any piece of paper he could find. When I asked him what they were, he said, "They're the paths to where we're all going." That stayed with me for a long time. There was a guy who swore that a dark figure stood at the end of his bed every night. He said it didn't move or speak, but just watched him. He wasn't the only patient in that room, but none of the others ever saw anything. One patient believed that she had been cursed by a witch she met before being admitted. She would constantly scratch her arms, claiming she could feel something crawling under her skin. No matter how much we tried to calm her down, nothing seemed to work. I had a patient who always talked about the others living in the walls. He'd press his ear against the wall and say he could hear them whispering. No one else ever heard anything, but his obsession with the idea made it feel like maybe he did know something we didn't. There was a man who would rock back and forth and chant in a language none of us could understand. One night, a nurse swore she heard the same chanting coming from a different part of the ward, even though the patient was asleep in his room. We had a patient who refused to look in mirrors. She said if she did, her reflection would start moving on its own. We removed all mirrors from her room, but once, while she was in a common area with a mirror, she screamed and refused to go near it again. To this day, I still wonder what she thought she saw. There was one guy who claimed that he was already dead and that we were all living in some kind of afterlife. He would often say things like, "You'll see soon enough," in a way that gave everyone the chills. It didn't help that he always seemed to know about upcoming deaths in the ward before anyone else did. The patient always insisted that someone was hiding under her bed, but whenever we checked, there was nothing there. She would become hysterical if we tried to make her sleep on the bed, so she spent most nights on the floor instead, saying, "It's safer down here." I had a patient who always drew doors on the walls. When asked why, he said they were portals and that the real danger was in the doorways. One day, he warned me to never walk through a doorway without checking first. To this day, I still hesitate when I cross through doors. There was a patient who swore that the lights flickered because they were trying to get in. Every time the power went out, he would scream that they had finally broken through. It was creepy because, for some reason, the lights flickered more often in his room than anywhere else on the ward. One patient refused to let anyone touch him, saying he had something inside of him that he didn't want to pass on to anyone else. He would always ask for gloves when we had to interact with him, and the fear in his eyes was genuine. We had a guy who would talk about his past life like it was more real than his current one. So he said that in his other life, he had made a deal with something dark and was now paying the price. The details he gave were too specific and chilling to just be a story. One patient kept saying she could hear the dead. She said they were calling out for help, but no one else could hear them. The strangest part was that every time she mentioned hearing someone, it was always right before another patient passed away. There was a patient who always smiled in the creepiest way possible, no matter what was going on. He could be angry, upset, or even crying, but that eerie smile never left his face. It was so unsettling that most of the staff avoided making eye contact with him altogether. I had a patient who always insisted that we were all just figments of his imagination and that none of us were real. And he would say things like, "When I wake up, you'll all be gone." It was hard to shake that uneasy feeling whenever I had to interact with him. So there was a woman who kept asking for rope. She said she needed it to climb up when they came for her. When we asked her who they were, she just said, "The ones who come in the night. You'll see." I never wanted to be on night shift after that. One guy constantly mumbled numbers, and when we asked him what they meant, he said, "There are the dates of when people will die." I didn't believe him at first, but one of the numbers he mentioned turned out to be the day one of the other patients passed away. It still haunts me. There was one patient who would always draw eyes, hundreds of eyes on everything, walls, paper, even his own arms. When we asked him why, he said, "They're watching us, always watching." It felt like those eyes were watching us too. One patient would only sleep sitting up in a chair because he said that if he laid down, they would come for him. Every time someone tried to get him to lie in a bed, he would panic and start screaming that they were already here. There was a man who claimed he could see shadows moving in the corners of the room, and he'd sit in one spot and stare at the same corner for hours, insisting that something was hiding there. He would say, "You can't see them yet, but they're there." That always gave me the creeps. I had a patient who always talked about the great storm that was coming. He said it would wipe out everything and that only a few would survive. He was so certain that it almost made me believe him. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something we didn't. There was one guy who always had his head tilted to the side, like he was listening to something. When I asked him about it, he said, "Can't you hear them? They're coming." After that, I never felt comfortable being in his room alone. I had a patient who would often stare blankly at the wall for hours. One day, I was checking on him when he suddenly turned to me and said, "They don't like it when you look at them." I asked who he was talking about, and he just shook his head, refusing to explain further. The unease in his voice made the hairs on my neck stand up. I couldn't help but feel like he was tapping into something dark and unseen. There was this one woman who claimed she could predict the future through her dreams. At first, we thought it was just another symptom of her condition, but then she started accurately predicting small events around the ward. She would say things like, "Don't go into that room, something bad will happen." And then it would. And one day, she told me that one of the nurses would fall ill, and sure enough, that nurse ended up with a severe flu the next day. It made me wonder if there was something more to her claims. Another patient had an obsession with the number 13. He would scratch it into the walls and repeat it over and over. When we asked him why, he just smiled and said, "It's the key." One night, during a particularly bad episode, he screamed that the 13 were coming for him. It felt like we were dealing with something beyond just a mental health crisis. I never found out what he meant, but the intensity in his eyes was chilling. There was a young girl who believed she was communicating with spirits through her drawings. She would draw strange symbols and figures that made no sense to any of us. One day, she handed me a drawing and said, "This is what they look like. They want you to know." The drawing gave me a sense of dread. It felt like I was holding a message from another world. It was hard to shake the feeling that there was something deeply unsettling about her talent. I had a patient who would laugh uncontrollably in the middle of conversations. It was like a switch would flip, and suddenly he'd be in hysterics over nothing at all. The laughter was so loud and manic that it sent shivers down my spine. One day, I asked him what was so funny, and he leaned in close and whispered, "You'll see soon enough." I've never been able to forget that moment. It was like he knew something I didn't. There was a patient who would sit in the corner of the room, mumbling to himself. When I approached, he looked up and said, "They're watching us, you know." I tried to reassure him, but he just kept staring, his eyes wide with fear. Later that night, we had a power outage, and I could hear him whispering again. It was as if he was talking to someone or something that wasn't there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, a patient started singing in a language I didn't recognize. It was haunting and melodic, almost like a lullaby. When I asked her where she learned it, she said, "From the voices." The other staff members and I looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. The song had a certain quality to it that felt ancient, and it left me feeling unsettled. I had a patient who was obsessed with the idea that he could see into other dimensions. He would often talk about the doors that separated a world from others. One day, he drew a detailed map of these supposed doors and claimed they were scattered all around the ward. The detail he put into it was eerie, and when I looked at the map, I felt like I was looking at something important, something I shouldn't have been seeing. One patient had a pet rock that he was convinced had special powers. He would carry it everywhere and talk to it as if it were alive. When I asked him why he needed it, he said, "It keeps the bad things away." The way he said it made me feel like he genuinely believed it. It was chilling to see how deeply his delusions affected him. I couldn't help but wonder what bad things he was so afraid of. There was a man who claimed to have once been a famous actor but had fallen into madness. He would reenact scenes from movies but in a disturbingly intense way. One time he got up on a table and performed an entire monologue, looking directly into my eyes. The intensity of his gaze made me feel like I was watching something real unfold. It was hard to tell where his performance ended and his reality began. I had a patient who would draw elaborate mazes, claiming they were the only way to escape the ward. One day she handed me a drawing and said, "Follow the path or you'll be trapped forever." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. I still have that drawing tucked away somewhere, a constant reminder of that unsettling encounter. There was a patient who spoke about the others living in the walls. He insisted that they whispered to him at night and would sometimes knock on the walls. We could never hear anything, but the fear in his eyes was palpable. One night, during a particularly loud storm, he started screaming that they were coming for him. It was horrifying to witness, and I can still remember the look of terror on his face. I once had a patient who would only talk about her past life. She claimed to have been a warrior in another time and said she still felt the adrenaline of battle. Her eyes would light up when she talked about it, and it was both fascinating and terrifying. There was a point where I had to remind myself that this was a psych ward and not a historical reenactment. The conviction in her voice was something I couldn't shake. One woman would often whisper to herself, and when I asked what she was saying, she replied, "They're planning something." It was vague and unsettling. As the days went on, her whispers became more frantic, and it felt like whatever she was referring to was something ominous. I couldn't help but feel that we were all somehow involved in whatever scheme she believed was unfolding. There was a patient who would sit in a circle with other patients and chant at the same time. When I approached to see what was happening, they all stopped and looked at me in unison. It felt like something out of a horror movie. I asked what they were chanting about, and one of them replied, "We're calling for help." The intensity of the moment made it hard to breathe, and I left the room feeling shaken. I had a patient who swore he could hear the thoughts of others. He would often shout things like, "Stop thinking that," or "I know what you're planning." It made for some awkward interactions, but there was a part of me that felt he might be tapping into something real. I remember one day he said something about a conversation I had with a co-worker earlier, and I was left wondering if he really did have some kind of insight. There was a patient who would wear a hoodie pulled over his face, never letting anyone see his eyes. He would mumble under his breath and occasionally let out a laugh that was too high-pitched. One day, he finally took off his hood and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and he said, "They come when you're not looking." That moment has haunted me ever since. I had a woman who was convinced she was being followed by a spirit. She would glance over her shoulder, constantly and often talk about the shadow that trailed her. So one day she said, "It's right behind you." I turned around half expecting to see something there. It was just the wall, but the fear in her eyes made me question everything. One patient would sit in silence for hours, then suddenly start laughing maniacally. It was so unpredictable that it became unnerving for everyone on the ward. One day, during a particularly loud outburst, he looked at me and said, "They know you're afraid. That's why they're here." The way he said it made me think that perhaps he was channeling something far beyond his own mind. I had a patient who often wrote letters to the others. When I asked her who she was writing to, she looked at me with a serious expression and said, "They're the ones who understand." The intensity of her belief left me feeling unsettled. I couldn't help but wonder who the others were and what they understood that we didn't. There was a man who believed he could see auras around people. He would often comment on the colors he saw and how they change based on a person's mood. One day, he looked at me and said, "You're blue. That means you're sad." It was shocking because I was feeling particularly overwhelmed that day. It felt like he was somehow tuned into something deeper. I had a patient who insists that she could communicate with animals. She would often talk about her conversations with birds and how they shared secrets with her. So it sounded bizarre, but there was a sincerity in her voice that made it hard to dismiss. So I once caught myself wondering if there was more to her connection than just a mental health condition. One night, a patient started chanting in a language none of us recognized. The sound echoed in the hallways, and it felt almost ritualistic. I approached her to see if she needed help, but when I got close, she looked right through me and continued chanting. It was one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had, and I still wonder what she was tapping into at that moment. There was a patient who told me that she could see people's past just by looking at them. She claimed to have witnessed terrible things in their lives that they hadn't shared. I asked her about my past, and she just smiled and said, "You don't want to know." The way she said it sent a chill through me, and I've often thought about what she might have seen. I had a patient who claimed to be able to communicate with the deceased. He would often sit quietly, as if listening to someone speaking to him. When I asked who he was talking to, he would say, "They want to tell you something." It left me feeling uneasy, as though he were acting as a medium between our world and the next. One day, a patient started crying uncontrollably, saying that the shadows were closing in on her. She described them as dark figures creeping closer every day. No matter how much we reassured her that she was safe, the terror in her eyes made it seem like she was experiencing something real. It was heartbreaking and chilling at the same time. There was a man who would often scribble in a notebook and mutter to himself about the experiment. When I asked what he meant, he just looked at me with wild eyes and said, "They're watching us." The intensity of his gaze made me feel like I was in a science fiction horror movie. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something we didn't. One patient insisted that she could smell emotions. She would describe scents in the room that corresponded to people's feelings. One day, she told me, "You smell like fear." I had been feeling particularly anxious, and it struck me how she could sense something so personal. It made me wonder if there was more to our senses than we realized. So I had a patient who was obsessed with conspiracy theories. He would often tell me how the government was implanting thoughts in our minds through the television. I chuckled at first, but he looked at me with such intensity that it made me pause. "So you think I'm joking, don't you?" he said, "but you have to see the signs." There was something unnerving about his conviction that stayed with me long after our conversation. I once had a patient who would draw detailed pictures of horrific events that he insisted had happened to him. But one day, he presented me with a drawing that depicted a dark figure looming over him while he slept. The details were so vivid that it sent shivers down my spine. When I asked him about it, he simply replied, "He comes for me at night. Maybe you should lock your doors." I had a hard time sleeping that night, thinking about what he might have been experiencing in his mind. There was a young girl who claimed she could see into the future. She would often tell us about terrible things that would happen to the staff or other patients. One day, she told me, "You're going to lose something very important to you." That very evening, I misplaced a piece of jewelry that I had always worn. The feeling of unease lingered long after her warning. It was as if her words had some weight to them, and I couldn't shake off the dread. One patient would spend hours staring at the ceiling, murmuring to himself. When I approached him, he looked at me with eyes wide open and said, "They're watching us." It sent chills down my spine. I felt like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant for me to see. Later, during rounds, I found out that he'd been saying similar things for weeks, always claiming he could see something in the corners of the room that we couldn't. I had a patient who insisted that the staff was conspiring against him. He would often pace back and forth in his room, mumbling about secret codes and hidden cameras. One day, he came up to me and whispered, "I know you're in on it. You have to stop them." The paranoia in his voice was so intense that I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. There was a woman who would talk to her reflection as if it were a separate entity. She would spend hours in front of the mirror, having conversations that made no sense to anyone else. One day, she turned to me and said, "She wants me to tell you that you're not safe." I remember feeling an icy chill in the air at that moment. It was as if something sinister had slipped through the cracks of her mind. I had a patient who would sing in a low, haunting voice about events that hadn't happened yet. It felt eerie to hear her serenade the room with predictions of doom. One time, she sang about a storm that would come for the staff. The very next day, there was a severe thunderstorm that knocked out power in the entire building. I remember feeling a strange sense of foreboding, as if she had somehow known it was coming. One patient would randomly burst into fits of laughter, then immediately switch to tears. During one of those transitions, she looked at me and said, "You're going to regret not believing me." It was chilling, as I wasn't sure what to believe or what she had meant. The rapid shifts in her mood were unsettling, and I often felt like I was in the presence of something truly unpredictable. But once had a man who would write letters to himself and place them under his pillow. One day, I caught him reading one aloud, but the words seemed to be a mix of different languages and symbols. When I asked him what it meant, he just smiled and said, "You'll understand when the time comes." I was left feeling confused and anxious, wondering what sort of knowledge he thought he possessed. There was a patient who claimed he could manipulate time. He would talk about how he could rewind moments in his life simply by closing his eyes. One day, he told me, "I'll prove it to you." He then closed his eyes and sat perfectly still for several minutes, muttering to himself. When he opened them, he looked directly at me and said, "See, it worked." I wasn't sure how to respond. The conviction in his voice made it hard to dismiss his claims as mere delusions. One time, a patient told me she could feel the emotions of the people around her as physical sensations. She described how she could feel their pain as if it were her own. When I asked her what my emotions felt like, she said, "You're afraid of something you don't even understand." That comment left me feeling vulnerable and exposed. It was unsettling to think that she could see something hidden within me. I had a patient who was convinced that he was living in a simulation. He would often talk about glitches in the world around him. To one day, he pointed to a clock on the wall and claimed it had just skipped ahead 10 minutes. I looked, and sure enough, the clock had changed. I felt a chill run down my spine as he grinned, saying, "See, they're watching." I left that interaction feeling disoriented, as if my reality had suddenly shifted. There was a woman who often spoke about a dark cloud that followed her everywhere. She would describe it in great detail, saying it whispered to her at night and clouded thoughts during the day. One time, she looked at me with desperate eyes and said, "I want you too." The feeling of dread was palpable, and I found myself glancing nervously at the windows, wondering if something unseen was indeed lurking outside. I once had a patient who insisted that she could hear the thoughts of others. She would look at me and say things like, "You're thinking about how you'll never escape." I was taken aback by her accuracy, as I had been feeling trapped and overwhelmed. It was unsettling to think she could read my mind, even if only partially. I often questioned whether her abilities were genuine or if they stemmed from her mental health struggles. One patient drew intricate mandalas that seemed to pulse with energy. When I looked at them, I felt a strange connection, as if they were drawing me in. One day, she told me, "They're alive, they want to speak to you." I couldn't help but feel unnerved by her statement. The drawings felt almost otherworldly, and it was hard to shake the feeling that something deeper lay within them. I had a patient who claimed to have conversations with angels. He would often smile, as if he was hearing something wonderful. One day, he turned to me and said, "They say you need to find your purpose." It was a seemingly benign statement, but the way he delivered it made me question what he truly believed. It felt like he had a connection to something beyond our reality. One patient would always talk about the doors that led to other dimensions. She described them in detail, saying they were hidden all around the ward. One night, she whispered to me, "You have to find the door, or you'll be trapped here forever." The intensity of her gaze made me feel as if she was warning me about something significant. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be a hidden truth in her words. I had a patient who claimed that she could see the real you behind your eyes. One day, she looked at me and said, "I can see your fears." I was taken aback. It felt like she was peeling back the layers of my persona. The way she said it made me question whether she was more in tune with reality than I realized. It left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. One time, a patient stood up during a group session and announced that she had been chosen for a mission. She spoke with such authority, saying that she was to lead us to a better place. It was unsettling to see her so confident in her delusions, and the way she looked at us was both mesmerizing and chilling. The conviction in her voice left everyone in the room speechless. There was a patient who would sit by the window and watch the sky for hours. One day she turned to me and said, "They're coming." When I asked who, she just smiled mysteriously. Her calm demeanor made the statement even more chilling. I couldn't help but wonder what she was waiting for and if there was something sinister behind her words. I had a patient who would only communicate through poetry. One day she handed me a poem that described a dark figure following her. The imagery was so vivid that it sent chills down my spine. When I asked her about it, she simply replied, "It's true, they're always with me." The haunting quality of her words lingered long after our conversation. One time, a patient looked directly at me and said, "You'll never leave here if you don't confront your past." It struck a chord deep within me. There was something unsettling about how she seemed to know my struggles. It left that interaction feeling shaken, questioning whether there was a hidden connection between us that went beyond the walls of the ward. I had a patient who often spoke in riddles. One day she looked at me and said, "The answer lies where the shadows meet the light." I was left perplexed, wondering what she could possibly mean. Her enigmatic statements were unsettling, as if she held knowledge that was just out of reach. I found myself pondering her words long after our conversation had ended.